Thank you all for coming out tonight. For those that don't know me, I'm Chris Sable, Executive Director for the Vail Symposium. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who helped make the Vail Symposium programming possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. I also would like to give a shout out to Gary Gilman and Julie Stokesen from Steam Master for providing these HEPA air filtration units that we've got going in here. We appreciate that as well. Our summer season is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls, and tonight's program is underwritten by Marla and Stuart Feldman. Tickets cover about 15% of our operating costs, so donors at any level make a difference. I'd like to give them all a big round of applause. Our next program takes place next Tuesday, July 19th. It will be at the Edwards Interfaith Chapel, and we're presenting this program in collaboration with the Vail Alliance for Purposeful Living. We're pleased to present former Medtronic President and CEO Bill George. He'll be doing a program on how you can use his book, Discover Your True North, to help you find your purpose in life. Should be a great program. And then on July 28th, in partnership with the Summer Vail Arts Workshop Legacy Project, we present Christo and Jean-Claude reflecting on the 50th anniversary of the Valley Curtain and the artist's legacy. And if you don't know, it's 50 years ago that they put the curtain up in Rifle, one of his early projects, and a whole group of students from the Somerville workshop helped with that project. So we're excited to do that project. Before we get started, I want to thank the Eagle River Presbyterian Church for making this space available to it. It's a lovely space. I also want to give a shout out to Rabbi Joel Newman and B'nai Vail. They're our partners in presenting this program, and we're very pleased to have them. And lastly, show of hands, who's read the book? Okay, show of hands, who hasn't read the book, and don't be embarrassed? Okay, great. So, tonight we welcome Jonathan Kaufman to discuss his book, The Last Kings of Shanghai. It's the remarkable story of two Jewish families, both originally from Baghdad, who stood astride Chinese business and politics for more than 175 years. Jonathan Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who has written and reported on China for 30 years for the Boston Globe, where he covered the 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square. He also works at the Wall Street Journal, where he served as the China bureau chief from 2002 to 2005, and at Bloomberg News. He's the author of A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America. He's the winner of the National Jewish Book Award. He's also the director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University in Boston. After his presentation, he's going to ask me to bring the microphone around to you to take questions from the audience. And I'll just let you know that the questions don't have to just be about what he presents on tonight. Since he heads a department at a college, many of you might have questions about what the hell is going on in our universities these days. What should I think if my students, my grandchildren are going to college? So we can open those up a little bit. Please give a warm welcome to Jonathan Kaufman.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you all for coming out. I am a professor now, so since so many of you read the book, I will be giving a quiz at the end of my remarks, and we'll be giving you all blue books and number 2 pencils, so I'm sure you remember how to use those. I wanted to talk a little bit about the book and how I came to write it, and I'll talk for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then leave time for your questions about the book and about some of the reaction to it, both from the families I wrote about, but also what I've been hearing as I talk about it around the country, but also increasingly around the world. What's interesting is, that the idea of what Jews did in China is not kind of a typical subject that I think anybody would write about or even think about. And my own interest in this topic began way back in the late 1970s when I was a young foreign correspondent sent to China to cover the opening of China to the United States. This was in the late 1970s. The US had just normalized relations with China in 1978. And I was sent over there, and I was in Shanghai as a young reporter. And this was back when China was still Red China. Mao had only died a few years before. Everybody in China was still wearing those blue Mao jackets with their blue Mao caps. Everything looked the same. It was like a black and white movie. There were far more bicycles on the streets than cars. It was very hard to get anyone to talk to you. And I was walking along the Bund in Shanghai, that beautiful street with the Art Deco buildings, and I had to use the bathroom. And so I went into a hotel, and it was like walking into a 1930s movie set. I walked in, and there was a beautiful marble floors, beautiful chandeliers, Lalique crystal windows. And I went up to a bellhop who was all dressed in white with a little white cap. And I asked him in English where the restroom was, and he responded to me in French. And as I left the hotel, I was kind of puzzled. What was this kind of movie set of a hotel doing in the middle of Red China? And someone told me that this hotel had been built by a Jewish playboy millionaire named Victor Sassoon. He had built it in the 1920s, and that in its time it was the fanciest hotel in all of Asia. And that Victor Sassoon had been not only the richest man in Shanghai, but one of the kind of greatest playboys that China had ever seen. And so I kind of filed that information away the way you do when you're a reporter, thinking one day you'll try to kind of return to it and dig out something that might fill out that story. A few years later, I was back in Shanghai, and at that point, the Chinese assigned essentially a minder to every foreign journalist who was visiting China, someone from the foreign ministry who was supposed to accompany you all the time to make sure you didn't do any stories that were embarrassing to the government or cause them any trouble. And so this fellow basically said to me, would you like to do a story about the Children's Palace? And the Children's Palace was this place, he said, where on weekends, Chinese parents would bring their kids to take ballet lessons and violin lessons. And it would be kind of a nice feature story. And I thought, well, okay, that would be kind of a nice story I could do for the Wall Street Journal, which I was working for at the time. And so I said, fine, let's go there. And we got there, and again, it was sort of an incredibly incongruous sight. This children's palace actually looked like a British country house. It could have, been in the credits of Downton Abbey. It was this beautiful British country house in the middle of Shanghai with a beautiful lawn in front of it. And when I went inside, there were, in fact, lots of Chinese parents with their kids practicing the violin. The ballet lessons were taking place in this huge ballroom that was as big as a football field with chandeliers and a massive staircase that led up to these, what had once clearly been bedrooms on the second floor. And as we left this mansion, I noticed a small plaque by the exit which said this had once been the house of the Kaduri family. Now, I knew the name Kaduri because I was living in Hong Kong at the time, and the Kaduris were one of the most, not only wealthiest, but one of the most powerful families in Hong Kong. They were a Jewish family, they were British citizens, they owned the Peninsula Hotel chain, they owned the China Light and Power Company, they were extremely powerful. but I hadn't realized that at one point they had lived in Shanghai in this huge mansion. And so that was another kind of fact that I sort of buried away. Many years later, I was sent to Beijing to open up the Wall Street Journal's bureau in Beijing. And at that point, I was married, my wife, Barbara Howard, who's here today as well, and we moved to Beijing with our 3 small kids. And we lived in Beijing, but we loved visiting Shanghai. The kids especially loved it because it was just a very exciting place, and it was a place that we always enjoyed exploring. On weekends, we would go out and find different parts of the city that we could explore. And one weekend, we went to a kind of a poorer part of Shanghai with a lot of sort of tenement buildings and alleyways that you could prowl up and down. And as we were exploring one of these old neighborhoods, we noticed that on the doorposts of many of these old tenement buildings, there were the nail holes and the shadows of what had once been where mezuzahs had been nailed up. Not the mezuzahs themselves, but the shadows of them and the nail holes that had once held them there. And again, I found myself wondering, what had these mezuzahs, what were they doing in Shanghai? And of course, as I found out, they had been put up there by some of the 18,000 Jewish refugees who had found safety in Shanghai during World War II. So all these kind of bits and pieces of knowledge kind of kept on coming to me. I kept on stumbling over them. And I finally decided I wanted to find out what was the broader story here. What was going on, these little pieces of history that I kept on stumbling over. And I wanted to find out what was going on. And the story for me actually started in Baghdad. Now, in Jewish history, any of us who have looked at Jewish history or the stories that we hear when we're growing up, we all know the Fiddler on the Roof story, right? Many of us come from that story about Jews whose families started in Russia in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, who started in ghettos, who made their way in Europe or came to the United States, started off poor, worked their way up, and made their way in business, in academics, in the professions, and reached real prosperity and success in the United States or in Europe. But the story of these Jews, the Sassoons and the Kaduris, is a completely different story, and one that I think Americans certainly, but really Jews anywhere are not very familiar with. It's the story of the Jews from Baghdad. And we actually first hear about these Jews in the Bible. These are Jews who were kidnapped. They were taken from Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. They were kidnapped by Nebuchadnezzar and taken to Babylon. Babylon is Baghdad. And we read about them in the Bible because these are the Jews who in the Psalms we read about, by the rivers of Babylon we wept when we remember Zion. These were the Jews who were taken to Babylon, to Baghdad, and wept because they wouldn't go back. Well, the history, as it turns out, is actually more complicated than that. The Jews who were kidnapped and were living in Babylon actually did extraordinarily well. Once they got there, they became traders, they became entrepreneurs, and they did so well that when they were given the opportunity to go back to Jerusalem, most of them decided to stay because they were helping the Turks or the Persians or whoever was ruling Baghdad at the time, gave them a lot of economic freedom. And in fact, the Jews of Baghdad became so wealthy and so influential that the leaders of Baghdad, usually the Turks, would turn to them for advice. And they would actually nominate the leading family of the Jews of Baghdad to almost a formal advisory position. They called them, this one family, the King of the Jews. And they would turned to them almost like the Secretary of the Treasury to get their advice about tax collections and trade agreements. And this leading Jewish family would meet regularly with a pasha, with the leaders of the Turkish community. And in fact, whenever the pasha had to meet with the leader of the Jewish community, the leader of the Jewish community would be carried through the streets of Baghdad in a sedan chair. And all the members, all the citizens of Baghdad, as the sedan chair passed, would tip their head in respect, whether they were Jew, Gentile, Muslim, to this king of the Jews as they passed. This family was the Sassoon family, one of the families that I write about. They were the most influential Jewish family in Baghdad and one of the most influential families, period. But as often happens in Jewish history, at a certain point in the early 1800s, history turned against the Jews of Baghdad. And the leaders of Baghdad, the Turkish leaders of Baghdad, began to arrest Jews in Baghdad and hold them for ransom. And so at the age of 37, David Sassoon, who was supposed to inherit this great family dynasty, this great family enterprise, was arrested by the government and put in jail for ransom. And his father rushed down to the jail, ransomed him out, but he realized that things were not going to get better for the Jews of Baghdad. And so he hustled his son down to the waterfront, and he put him on a boat and set him off to safety. And so David Sassoon, instead of taking over this great family enterprise, sailed away, leaving behind his wife and his children, never to return to Baghdad again. And so instead of Fiddler on the Roof, I think the story of the Sassoons really is in some ways a Shakespearean story. It's a story of a family that is almost a royal family that ends up losing everything and spends the rest of their time, the next 175 years, trying to get it back, trying to regain the position that's been ripped away from them. So David Sassoon sails away from Baghdad, from this immense fortune and influence that the family has had up till then. And he essentially starts out living in a warehouse. His first night outside of Baghdad, he's living on the floor of a warehouse, holding a gun, shooting at rats as they're skittering by. But as his father has put him onto the boat, he's also put a cloak around him. And in the folds of the cloak, he's sewn in precious gems, pearls and rubies and other precious gems, so his son will have something to start with in his new life. And David Sassoon makes his way to India. And he arrives in India just as the British are arriving in India and turning India into a colony. Now, I think we often think of Jews, whether it's in Europe or in America, sort of siding on the side of the underdog, of the downtrodden. Jews become socialists. Jews try to help the less fortunate. But in David Sassoon's case, he saw the British arriving in India. He saw British imperialism, and he decided that's where the future lay, that he was going to be on the side of the winners. And so he begins to work with the British and increasingly begins to trade with them. He works with them, and within a matter of a few years becomes immensely wealthy. And he's able, by building factories, by trading with the British, to get his family out of Baghdad and to get his children out of Baghdad. And he becomes an Anglophile. Even though he doesn't speak English at all, he makes sure his children, as they grow up, learn English. They all become British citizens. And when Queen Victoria ascends the throne, he has them all stand outside and in their heavily accented English declare their loyalty to Queen Victoria. So as the Sassoons are trying to figure out their place in this new British Empire, they realize that one of the ways to make riches very quickly is the opium trade. Opium is an incredibly lucrative industry in the 1840s and the 1850s. The Chinese are incredibly opposed to opium. Opium is essentially the heroin of its day. It's incredibly addictive. And to give you a sense of why the Chinese opposed it, these days we're living through the opioid epidemic. And basically about 2% of Americans are addicted to opioids. And we know the incredible pain and suffering that that's caused in the United States and the tremendous political blowback that it's caused. In China at this time, about 12% of Chinese were addicted to opium. And that's why the Chinese made shipments of opium illegal. You were not allowed to sell opium in China. But it was so lucrative that British companies were smuggling it in all the time. And the Chinese would try to intercept the traffic, but the British firms kept on selling it because they were making so much money. And in fact, the British found it so lucrative that British companies essentially convinced the British government to go to war against China to open up China's cities to more and more opium sales. And so in the 1840s, there were two wars. They're called the Opium Wars, where Britain essentially goes to war with China, defeats China twice, and forces China to open up its major cities, Shanghai, Hong Kong, cities up and down the coast, to the free trade of opium. And opium sales increased dramatically in China, and more Chinese are addicted to opium, and this is one of the reasons why China becomes so weak, and that so many foreign countries, including the United States, France, Germany, are able to go into China and begin what the Chinese even today call the 100 years of humiliation. Now, what this means for the Sassoons is that it's a business opportunity. And the Sassoons look at this and say, well, how can we take advantage of this? And I'll talk more about kind of the moral reckoning that this causes, but it's important to kind of look at this and understand kind of the calculation that the Sassoons and other businessmen make about opium. And so from a business point of view, what the Sassoons say is we can be better businessmen than all these other British rivals who are going in there selling opium. And so what the Sassoons do is they take these kind of innovative entrepreneurial leaps about selling opium. They are first to invest in steamships to get the opium from India, where it's grown, to China, where they're going to sell it. All their British rivals are still using sailing ships, which take a couple of weeks to get from India to China. The Sassoons invest in steamships, which allow them to get the opium a lot faster to China. They invest in the telegraph, which means they can get information about prices in China faster to India. Most importantly, they use their family to run the enterprise. David Sassoon has 8 sons, and he uses these 8 sons to basically run the business. He sends one of sons to different cities across China, and they communicate all the time via telegraph, saying, oh, the price of opium is higher in Shanghai now. Put the opium on the steamships, get it to Shanghai. But it's lower in Hong Kong, so don't move quite as fast. And so by 1860, 1870, the Sassoons are moving so creatively, so entrepreneurially, that they've driven all their British rivals out of the opium trade. And I was able to see a lot of the records of their British rivals, and you can see the kind of anti-Semitism in these records, where the British rivals are like, who are these Jews? Who are these hook-nosed Jews who are beating us out in China and winning, all the trade? And by the 1860s, 1870s, the Sassoons essentially dominate the opium trade. In 1949, when the communists conquered China, they seized all the Sassoon business records in Shanghai. And they concluded, and I saw the records myself, and they're right, that the Sassoons made about $1 billion, B for billion, about $1 billion selling opium in China. And that became the foundation of what became one of the greatest fortunes in the world. Now, if you talk to the Sassoons today, they will say, well, you know, selling opium was a vice. It was like cigarettes. It was like alcohol. And that's true. Opium was legal at the time. And in fact, one of the things the Sassoons did was that they enticed British aristocracy, even the Prince of Wales, to invest in opium. They would go to the Prince of Wales and say, if you buy some opium now and sell it in a month, you'll make a profit. And in Europe at the time, aspirin wasn't widely used. You could use little bits of opium and that would help relieve pain. The British taxed opium in India and used it to kind of fund the government, their colonial government there. But the fact is, the Sassoons knew how bad opium was. None of the Sassoons used opium themselves. If you look at the Sassoon business records, it's filled with situations where they had to fire some of their own Chinese employees because they had become, as they called it, useless because they were addicted to opium. There were all sorts of efforts by Protestant organizations opposed to the opium trade to try to stop the opium trade, both in the United States and in Britain. And the fact is, the Sassoons, when you read through their letters and so forth, didn't consider the Chinese to be, you know, as human as they were. You know, they wanted the opium. The Sassoons were happy to sell it to them. And again, I think as Jews and as people who think about Judaism, we like to think that Jewish businessmen maybe act with more morality than others. The fact is, in this case, the Sassoons were like every other British businessman at the time. They were imperialists, they were colonialists, and I think it was Balzac who said, behind every great fortune lies a great crime, and in the case of the Sassoons, that crime was opium. Now, the opium trade was finally abolished in 1913, and the Sassoons then moved their money into real estate and into lots of other areas. But the Chinese never forgot it. And even later, and when the communists took over, the Chinese always remembered kind of who had traded in opium and who hadn't. I want to talk now a little bit about the women in this story, because I think the role of women, especially in the 19th century, is often forgotten because, frankly, there were very few records of women, and in some ways the women played a really extraordinary but maybe hidden role. And especially if we're talking about morality, I think the women in some ways were the conscience of both families, the Sassoons and the Kaduris, who I'll talk about in a little bit. In 1905, so the Sassoons, as I said, the Sassoons had 8 sons, and after they had done their time in China, building up the fortune and so forth, David Sassoon believed the future lay in London, that if the Sassoons wanted to become a global financial empire, they had to go to London. And so one by one, he began to send his sons to London with instructions to buy big houses, buy mansions, hobnob with the British aristocracy, send their sons to Eton and to Cambridge, and to entertain the British aristocracy. And that's what the Sassoon sons did. There was a joke about Brighton, which was where a lot of the British aristocracy would build their houses, that Brighton consisted of a group of British aristocrats with a Sassoon at either end, because the Sassoons would buy these great houses. And they would have these enormous parties where they would invite the Prince of Wales. They would also fund the Prince of Wales' gambling habit. They would go on rest cures with the Prince of Wales to the equivalent of places like Vail or Aspen, and sort of kind of get invited to Buckingham Palace. What that meant was that all the boys, all the sons, were hobnobbing it in Britain, and nobody was really watching the business in China and in India that was producing all this wealth. And at one point in the late 19th century, the youngest Sassoon's son died unexpectedly of a heart attack. And this was kind of a crisis for the family, because who was going to keep an eye on the business? And so his wife, Flora Sassoon, came forward and said she would run the business as sort of a regent until their son, who was still a teenager, could step up and take things over and kind of, do what, restore the male line. And so her brothers-in-law, who were in London, all agreed, figuring, what's Flora going to do? She's just a woman. She'll kind of keep things going, and they'll still run things. But it turned out Flora Sassoon was an extraordinarily smart and clever businesswoman. She spoke several languages, and she had just an incredible capacity for business. And this was at a time when not only women didn't have the right to vote, but in India, women couldn't even appear in public. They operated under what was called purdah, which meant they literally could not be seen in public. So she began running this huge Sassoon business operation from her living room. But gradually, in somewhat of a scandal, she began appearing publicly, going to the Sassoon offices, visiting factories, and making major business decisions. And in a situation much like we've been facing, there was a plague that erupted all throughout Bombay, a bubonic plague. And Indian workers were terrified and refused to show up at factories. And this was a challenge, and it was a frightening prospect for the Sassoons. Their factories were closing down, workers were afraid to show up, and no one quite knew what was going to happen. And so Flora Sassoon arranged to have a number of scientists flown in from Europe and funded their search for a vaccine. They found a vaccine, but the Indian workers were afraid to take it. Sounds familiar. And so she arranged to have that she would take the vaccine first, but that she would be photographed taking it, and that she would show her bare arm and be photographed getting the vaccine. And again, this was kind of a scandalous idea that a Western woman would show her bare arm and get a vaccine, and that photograph would be distributed to all the workers. But it worked. And because of that, the workers took the vaccine, the factories reopened, and the companies were saved. But all this made the brothers-in-law in London very nervous, because they began to worry that Flora would not be, easily told what to do, and that she might end up having more of a spine than they thought. And so essentially, they staged a boardroom coup and drove her out of the business. She ended up moving to London. She became a very well-known philanthropist and Jewish scholar, but she never set foot in the Sassoon businesses again. In some ways, as a friend of mine said, she hit the bamboo ceiling and was never able to continue in the businesses. Another woman I have great admiration for, and I think had a huge impact on the family, was Laura Kaduri. Now, as the Sassoons were expanding throughout China especially, one of the challenges they faced was who was going to run all these offices they were opening across China. They had 8 sons, but they needed other people to run things. And so one of the solutions David Sassoon came upon was that he would go to right back to Baghdad and would spread word among other Jewish families in Baghdad, saying, if you send us your sons, because it was always sons, we will guarantee that they get an education, that they get training for business, and then we'll employ them. We will send them to China and give them jobs. And once they're in China, we will build Jewish hospitals so they'll get medical care. We'll build synagogues so they can worship. We'll even build Jewish cemeteries in China, so if they die, they can have a Jewish burial. And so he started, essentially these are almost like Jewish towns he was going to build so that he could convince families to send their sons to work for the Sassoons. And so this pipeline of Jews from Baghdad began coming to China to work for the Sassoons. The Kaduri family was a fairly upper middle class family, but they had fallen on hard times. And so Rima Kaduri decided to send 4 of her sons to work for the Sassoons. The youngest was Eli Kaduri. He was only 14 when he left Baghdad and went to work for the Sassoons. And I try to imagine what it was like to be 14 years old, to leave your family, to show up in Bombay, to go to school there, and at 18 to be sent to China. He didn't speak a word of Chinese. He was sent to a small town to the north of Shanghai to work for the Sassoons in this little trading post. But Eli Kaduri, it turned out, was very ambitious. And he very quickly realized that you could make a lot of money in China very quickly. So he quit working for the Sassoons and decided to start working for himself. And he made his way to Hong Kong, began trading, began forming all these business alliances. And by the time he was 30, was a millionaire many times over. And at 30, he decided it was time for him to get a wife. So he hopped on a ship to London, made his way to London, and met a woman, Laura Makata, who was from a very well-to-do British Jewish family. They fell in love, and they decided to get married. Now, at that point, what should have happened was that they would get married in London, she would get pregnant, Eli would go back to China and resume his business career, coming home a couple of times a year to sort of see Laura and the children, and they would live this kind of separate life, which is what most men did at that point. But Laura was a very strong-willed woman. She was actually older than Eli, and her parents were very worried that she would be a spinster. She had already done some traveling, and she announced that she was not going to stay in London. She was going to accompany Eli back to China. And so the two of them sailed back to Hong Kong. She quickly got pregnant, had 2 small children, and then said she was going to travel with Eli wherever he went in China. Even more remarkable for my purposes, she kept a diary of her travels. And the diary reads almost like, a Katharine Hepburn movie, like The African Queen, where she travels. Now, again, she was a wealthy British woman, so she's traveling with like nannies and servants and all that. But still, this is like the early 1900s in China. And she's traveling and seeing civil war breaking out. She's in these rickshaws on these rutted roads. She's seeing the incredible poverty all throughout China. And one of the things that she concludes as she sees the desperate poverty all around her is that the real problem in China is that girls are not being educated. This is a pretty extraordinary thing. I mean, 100 years later, everyone will sort of conclude that. But this is something Laura realizes in like the early 1900s. And so she convinces her husband to build and to fund schools for Chinese girls. Chinese girls have no education at this point. Chinese boys barely have education. And so she convinces her husband to fund schools for girls, for Chinese girls. Not only in China, but also back in Baghdad, where his family was originally from. The family finally settles in Shanghai, and they move into a grand house in Shanghai. And at one point, a fire breaks out in the mansion. Laura runs out, but she's convinced that the Chinese servant she's hired to be a nanny to the boys is still trapped inside the house. And so she runs back into the burning house to rescue the nanny. And she becomes disoriented by the flames. It turns out that the nanny had gotten out through another doorway. Laura is disoriented by the smoke and the flames, and she collapses and she dies in the house fire. Now, this is obviously a tragedy for the Kaduri family, but it's something that for the Chinese is almost unbelievable. The idea that a wealthy Western woman would run into a burning house to save a Chinese servant is something that the Chinese to this day still talk about. That would happen is something they can't even conceive of. And it's something that really makes a mark on the two boys, her two boys, who begin to get some sense of her conscience, how important understanding the Chinese, not just as a business or a place to make money, but that these are real people, and that being British and being imperialist and being colonialist, that there's more to the relationship with China than just money. And I think, as we'll see later on, this becomes very important. I want to jump ahead now to the 1930s. There's been a lot of interest in turning this book into a movie, and if that ever happens, the star of the movie, I think many of you who have read the book will agree, is Victor Sassoon. Victor Sassoon is the Jewish playboy millionaire who built the hotel that I went into looking for the bathroom in the late 1970s. Victor Sassoon grew up in Europe. He was from the branch of the family that had moved to Europe and become great socialites and so forth. And everyone thought Victor Sassoon would be one of those Sassoons who made a lot of money and spent a lot of money. He grew up, and even in college, he went to Cambridge, always had the best wine cellar in Europe. He was always seen with a chorus girl on each arm, and was a playboy in London and had just an extraordinary social life. During World War I, he was a pilot, and his plane crashed, and he became a cripple. He lost the use of his legs and spent the rest of his life after World War I either on crutches or in a wheelchair. And he fell into a depression and believed he would never have the kind of extraordinary social life he had been counting on. And so he decided to go to China and to India to see if he could, try his hand at business. And he was a brilliant businessman, but even a better playboy. He decided to move all the money to Shanghai and to build this extraordinary hotel called the Peace Hotel, which he turned into the social hub of all of Asia, but certainly of Shanghai. Right now we're all planning our post-COVID trips, right? Where are we going to go? What are the places we want to see? And if this were 1927, 28, 1930, the trips we'd be planning would be to go to Shanghai. Everybody wanted to go to Shanghai. Everybody wanted to stay at Victor Sassoon's hotel. Charlie Chaplin boarded a cruise ship because he wanted to meet Victor Sassoon and stay in the Peace Hotel. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives in a suite at the Peace Hotel. Wallace Simpson, who would go off later and marry the King of England and make him leave his throne, was photographed in Shanghai only wearing a life jacket, nothing else, which gives you a sense of what Shanghai was like. It was exotic, it was a little bit naughty, but it was a place where celebrities, had to go. And Victor Sassoon loved that life. He would have these extraordinary parties where he would dress up as a circus ringmaster, and all the invited guests had to dress up as circus acts. he would dress up as a schoolmaster, and everyone had to dress up, as school children. When I was doing my research, I visited the hotel, and they had just restored his penthouse where he lived, which overlooked his empire in Shanghai. And I was given a tour of it, and I went into his bathroom, and there were 2 bathtubs in the bathroom. And I said, "Why are there 2 bathtubs here?" And the Chinese guy taking me around kind of blushed, and he said, "Well, Victor Sassoon always said he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath." So that's what it was like being Victor Sassoon. In fact, when I was doing my research for the book, Victor Sassoon never married in China. He ended up marrying his nurse later in life when he was in the Bahamas. His nurse was from Dallas, so for complicated reasons, his business diaries ended up in Southern Methodist University in Dallas, next to the George Bush Library. It was kind of a bizarre thing. And so I was down at SMU going through his business diaries where he had like every business deal. And then as I was opening them, these pictures of naked women started falling out. And I was mortified, thinking the librarian was going to come over and like kick me out. And it turned out that one of the ways Victor Sassoon made his conquest was that he was an amateur photographer. So he would go down as these cruise ships were arriving with all these celebrities and would bring his camera and would say to the women, "Would you like to come to my studio and I'll photograph you?" And then he would get them there and would, entice them or whatever to take their clothes off, and would then take their picture but file them under business contacts. So he would, you would read about some business deal he'd be doing with an oil company, and in the evening he went out with this woman and had her take her clothes off. But it was interesting because the women actually were Western, Indian, and Chinese. So you could actually see the way he was breaking down social barriers by sleeping with Chinese women and Indian women. And I would quickly put the pictures back in and turn the page. But that was Victor Sassoon. So he really had this incredible social hub swirling around him in Shanghai. Now, starting in 1937-38, those cruise ships that were coming from Europe stopped bringing celebrities and started bringing another group of people. And these were Jewish refugees. By 1937-38, of course, the Nazis have taken over in Germany. They have begun and then eventually take over Austria. And Jewish families are desperate to get out of Europe. And as we know, every place around the world starts to shut the gates, right? The US won't accept Jewish refugees. The UK won't accept them. One by one, every country is shutting the gates, except Shanghai. Because Shanghai was essentially carved up by different countries, right? The British occupied part of Shanghai, the Americans occupied part, the Japanese were coming in occupying part, the French occupied part. There was no functioning government in Shanghai. And what that meant was that if you made it to Shanghai, even as a Jewish refugee, you were safe. You didn't have to show a visa. They couldn't stop you. If you made it to Shanghai, you could stay. And so word of this begins to spread, especially in Vienna and Berlin. And so middle-class Jewish families, or upper-class Jewish families, begin to sell all their belongings to buy tickets on these cruise ships to go to this place called Shanghai, which most of them, may have heard about, but didn't know much about, but knew that if they could get on one of these cruise ships, they had a chance at being safe. And so starting in 37-38, about 1,000 people every month are coming off these cruise ships, landing in Shanghai looking for safety. And the pictures are extraordinary because these cruise ships are showing up in Shanghai. The refugees from Vienna and Berlin are mostly upper middle class. They're merchants, musicians, shop owners, middle-class folks, all dressed as if they're going for like a stroll down the streets of Vienna. And they're looking down at these streets thronged with Chinese, pulling wheelbarrows or rickshaws. The Germans don't speak any Chinese. The Chinese don't speak any German or English, and the refugees are pouring off. And at this point, the Kaduris and the Sassoons, who are the two wealthiest families in Shanghai, face this crisis. What are they going to do? So Eli Kaduri, who is sort of a very wealthy man, but he's not cool. He's not someone you would invite, or that Victor Sassoon would invite to one of his parties. But he confronts Victor Sassoon. Eli Kaduri goes to Victor Sassoon's fancy penthouse. He's never been to any of the parties, and he says to Victor Sassoon, "You've got to stop being a playboy. This is a crisis for our people. You have to do something." And to his credit, Victor Sassoon immediately begins to turn over a lot of the real estate he owns, turns it into dormitories for these refugees. He begins to hire many of them to work for him. The Kaduris set up a school because all these children have suddenly shown up. They have no structure. They're literally running around the streets of Shanghai. The Kaduris hire teachers who are among the refugees and begin to start classes for them so the kids will have something to do during the day. Victor Sassoon begins to pay for milk and for food to be delivered to these refugees as they come off the ships. Victor Sassoon even flies to South America to see if he can persuade South America countries to buy land up where the refugees can settle. But the most extraordinary thing Victor Sassoon does is he begins to talk to the Japanese. The Japanese, at this point, are aligned with the Nazis. And the Nazis are trying to pressure the Japanese, who have surrounded Shanghai. It's before Pearl Harbor. They haven't moved into Shanghai yet because they don't want to antagonize the Americans and the British. They want to keep America out of the war. They want to keep Britain out of the war. So they don't want to conquer Shanghai yet. But they want this Jewish thing to stop. The Nazis are saying, you have a Jewish problem now. Every month, thousands of Jews are coming here. So the Japanese appoint an anti-Semitic Japanese colonel to be in charge of Shanghai's Jewish problem. And he meets with Victor Sassoon, and he says, this has to stop. And Victor Sassoon, basically, who could charm anyone, says to this anti-Semitic colonel, "I want your officers to be comfortable at my hotel, come to my clubs, maybe I'll invest in some of your Japanese factories." And he just continues to sort of charm him. And every month, more Jews are being saved, more Jews are being saved, as Victor Sassoon pulls this kind of con game on the Japanese. Ultimately, 18,000 Jews are let into Shanghai. Finally, the Japanese realize what's going on, and Victor Sassoon has to flee. He has to get out of Shanghai before they arrest him. Pearl Harbor comes, the Japanese arrest all the Westerners there. The Kaduris don't get out on time, and so they arrest Eli Kaduri and his entire family. Eli Kaduri eventually dies under Japanese house arrest. But what's amazing is that Victor Sassoon has done such a good con job on the Japanese that even when the Nazis are saying, "We want you to kill these Jews you've got," the Japanese resist. The Nazis even send over members of the Gestapo who have been working in Poland and liquidating the Jewish communities of Poland. They send these Gestapo members over, and they say to the Japanese, "Look, you've got these 18,000 Jews here. What you need to do is to round them up, put them on ships in the middle of the sea, and then sink the ships, and that will get rid of your Jewish problem." The Japanese refused to do that. Instead, they put them in one neighborhood, which they call a ghetto, but actually the Jews can move back and forth. But during the entire war, even though the Japanese are allies of the Nazis, none of the Jews are killed. And when the war ends and the Americans liberate Shanghai, the Americans are stunned to discover this huge Jewish community in which none of the Jews are killed. And one of the most moving and poignant pictures is all of the Jewish refugees. When the Americans arrive, they're asking for news about their relatives back in Europe because they've been cut off. And the Americans tell them, and they put up posters on the windows of stores listing all the villages that have been wiped out. And it's only then that the Jewish refugees realize what's happened in Europe. They've been complaining about, how the food wasn't good and conditions were so bad for them, but they didn't realize that they missed being annihilated. After the war, the Sassoons and the Kaduris come back. Victor Sassoon comes back, the Kaduris come back. They think the parties will resume. They think that life will resume as it did before the war. But of course, that doesn't happen. The communists quickly encircle Shanghai. Victor Sassoon has to flee. He loses almost everything because all of his money is in real estate at that point. He gets a return ticket to Shanghai, but he never comes back. And in fact, he really sounds almost like a rejected lover. He says, I didn't give up on China. China gave up on me. And he settles in the Bahamas, and he never returns. The Kaduris are different. Eli Kaduri has died of the Japanese occupation. His two sons, who are now in their 40s, go to Hong Kong, which is a British colony. And they decide to stay in Hong Kong. And over the next 40 or 50 years, they help rebuild Hong Kong into this thriving city, which becomes incredibly prosperous. They become richer than ever. But they do two things that are very important. One is they decide that their father made a mistake in Shanghai, that he was so isolated from the Chinese that he missed the rise of communism. He lived in that huge mansion that I visited years later. There were only 3 of them living in a mansion with 43 rooms and 44 servants. And his sons decide that they'll never be that isolated again. And so even while they're making another fortune, they help 300,000 Chinese refugees who are fleeing communism make their way to Hong Kong, and they give a tremendous amount of money to help these Chinese refugees start small farms, and they research ways in which these Chinese farmers can grow better crops, but also can raise pigs, because pork obviously is a staple of the Chinese diet. And so they do research into producing bigger pigs, fatter pigs, that the Chinese can sell and feed people, but also make more money. And in fact, even today, when you go to Hong Kong and talk to the Chinese there, they will tell you, the Kaduris know everything about pigs except what it tastes like. So, and the Kaduris also, throughout the Cultural Revolution, all the ups and downs of China, never say a bad word about the communist Chinese government, because they always believe that at some point China will open up again and will need the Kaduris to kind of lead them and to work with them. And sure enough, in 1978, when China does open up, they reach out to the Kaduris, and the Kaduris today are worth $13 billion, B for billion. They're the wealthiest Western family in China. They meet regularly with Xi Jinping, the president of China. And like a lot of Westerners and a lot of Hong Kong Chinese, they are now caught in what's going on in China. And they are trying to walk this tightrope, once again, about being capitalists and trying to understand where China is going. But they are very much a part of China's growth and China's ascendancy. So I just want to sort of close on this notion of like, why do these families matter? And I think they matter in part because it does seem that wherever Jews land, right, wherever they end up, whether it's the United States or Europe or China, they end up doing remarkable things, but also becoming part of these societies, right? Jews don't just end up in some corner of the society just doing Jewish things. I mean, they do that. They go to synagogues and they care about other Jews. But I think certainly in America we've seen the way in which Jews play a really important role in politics and business and entertainment. And I think here you see, these two families who end up playing this remarkable role in China's rise and in good ways, in bad ways. And so I think that's something that we can take pride in, but also can step back and kind of ask ourselves questions about, the decisions that we make as Americans and as Jews, and sort of look at the decisions that these two families make, and kind of think about the positions that we're in sometimes, and the choices that we make in the same way these families faced difficult and complex choices as well. But I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to bring the microphone around, and if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring it to you, then I'll take it away, and I'll bring it to the next person. Hold the microphone like this, not like this. It doesn't really work. Hold it close. Don't turn anything on or off. Lastly, make sure that your question is actually a question. We don't need a lot of backstory. We just want to get to the questions so we can get to as many as possible.
Thanks, Jonathan, for coming. How do you see China developing, and what should America's policy be towards China?
That's a great question. I think short term, it's going to be pretty difficult. I think it's pretty clear China is going to be very nationalistic, very powerful, has a very strong view about where it sees its future. So I think we're preparing for, if not a Cold War, a lot of conflict. I think that longer term, in the end, I think China and the US need to find some way to cooperate and need to work that out. And I think over 5 or 10 years, I'm hoping that'll become clear to both sides. So I'm hoping that there'll be kind of a reasoned approach. But I think over the short term, it's going to be dicey. And I think that, in talking to people, I think the Democrats and the Republicans both would have ended up where we are. In other words, I think it's been pretty clear that we were coming to a reckoning. And I think that's going to take 2 or 3 years to work out. I only hope that reasonable people on both sides won't let it get out of control, and that we'll find a way to kind of get things back on track maybe 4 or 5 years from now.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman, I had a law partner by the name of Shapiro who grew up as a child during the war in Japan, and there were Jewish refugees in Japan as well as in China. And he said one of the things was that the Japanese never understood anti-Semitism. They didn't understand the distinction between Jews and Christians. They were just all Caucasians. Did you get any sense of that in doing your research, that that also might have been why the Japanese didn't go after the Jews in Shanghai and Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, I know more about the Chinese case. What's interesting is China is one of the few places in the world where you can go and you don't run into anti-Semitism. And part of the reason for that is that, when we talk about the Chinese refugees, the Jewish refugees in China, a number of those refugees especially the children, have gone on to have sort of pretty important positions, right? So Larry Tribe, the Harvard law professor, was a refugee. Michael Blumenthal, the US Secretary General, was a refugee. Peter Max, who you might remember did those posters, was a Chinese refugee. Most important in some ways was Shaul Eisenberg, became an Israeli arms dealer, was a refugee. And in 1978, China fought this war with Vietnam, which was a little war, and the Chinese didn't do very well. And so the Chinese foreign minister comes to America. Even though Carter is president, the Chinese meet with Henry Kissinger. And they say to Kissinger, we didn't do well in that war with Vietnam. We want to buy some anti-tank missiles that America uses that are good against Soviet-made tanks. Kissinger says, we can't sell them to you. You're still technically an enemy. But you know who has really good missiles that are good against Soviet-made tanks are the Israelis, because they used them against the Arabs in the 1973 war. So they go to Israel, and Eisenberg gets involved in this, and over the next 20 years, Israel, basically these unmarked planes, fly from Tel Aviv to Beijing with huge arms shipments. And in 1999, Israel and China have official recognition. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is always going to Shanghai and talking about the refugees. So there's kind of a geopolitical thing going on. The other part is the Chinese now love to talk about the Jewish refugees. It's a great story for them. And if you go to Shanghai, there's quite a good Jewish refugee museum. But in a genuine way, there's a wonderful documentary out called Harbor from the Holocaust, which was a Chinese filmmaker who went back and tells the Chinese story. And there are all these Chinese families who say, you know, yes, these Jewish refugees showed up and they were suffering too, and we were suffering, and we tried to help them. And so I think there's a way in which those ordinary stories and the refugees tell those stories too, about the Chinese being nice to them. And so I think there's a way, and frankly, Eli Kaduri, the fellow I speak about, the patriarch of the family, he at one point is trying to get Sun Yat-sen, who's like the George Washington of China, to endorse the Balfour Declaration. And Sun Yat-sen writes this extraordinary letter where he says, you, the Jewish people, have never had a homeland. We, the Chinese people, have lost our homeland. Let us work together. So I think there are a lot of ways in which the Chinese kind of admire Jews. And so I think that's part of what has led to this kind of appreciation of Jews. I mean, they think we're good at making money and all that, but I also think that there's an admiration for Jews among the Chinese, which is kind of nice to see.
How and where did you begin your research?
I'm sorry?
How and where did you begin your research?
Well, the research was all over the place because these families were so spread out. So I was in, Shanghai and Hong Kong, Dallas, as I mentioned, London, New York. It was pretty extensive, and the families were very cooperative. At one point, I was in Jerusalem talking to one of the Sassoons, and he said to me, it was like midnight, and I was in his living room, and they had a lot of papers, and he said to me, what's the oldest piece of paper you've ever held? I'm from New England, so I said, I don't know, probably 1775. And he takes this thing out, he goes, this is from 760, and it was actually part of a will from the Sassoons of a dowry kind of outlining things like that. So there was a lot of stuff out there. There was also, interestingly, in Britain, when the Sassoons were in Britain, a lot of their wills were filed in Britain, and you can see how they were so terrified of the daughters and sons marrying outside the faith. And you could hear them thundering that they had to marry someone Jewish, someone from Baghdad, and of course they didn't, right? But you could see how these, you could hear their voices kind of worried about what was going to happen as the families became wealthier and more influential, and then, became more assimilated.
What source of research was most helpful for you?
What research was?
What source of research was most helpful for you?
Was more?
Most helpful for
Oh,
you.
most helpful? Well, probably the best was the Kaduri brothers, the two sons, wrote to each other almost every day. And what they did was they used carbon paper. So it was almost like early, like a 1930s Facebook, right? So they would write to each other and in carbon, and they kept the carbon, but then they would write back on carbon paper. So you could see them literally responding to sort of the entries. And so you could almost hear their voices. And so one of them would write, stop spending so much time with the refugees, you've got to spend more time as a businessman. And then he'd write back saying, stop telling me what to do. And so you kind of got that sense. One thing I will tell you, Instagram and all that stuff is going to make life hell for historians and biographers in 50 years. I mean, you're going to have all these historians basically looking at, K or whatever, or looking at things like that, and it's going to be almost impossible. There's nothing like holding a letter and hearing the voices. It's going to be much harder going forward.
You jokingly started your talk threatening us with a blue book and a pencil, so I thought maybe I'd throw that back at you and ask you to compare and contrast the Sassoons with the Sacklers.
No, that's come up a lot. And look, it's difficult. I mean, this whole question of are people business people, and you just judge them as business people, I think we have always liked to think that Jews in business have a higher standard, right? I mean, we like to believe that. And when they turn out to be just like every other business person, that's the way they are. Now, I can certainly, it is true, I mean, the Sassoons and the Kaduris were certainly better in how they treated the Chinese in business in some ways. They hired them, they probably paid them more, but on something like opium, for the Sassoons for sure, that was, they did what everybody else did. And look, there are a lot of books out there about the Sacklers, and it's pretty bad stuff. And I think in that sense, I don't think there was anything Jewish about what the Sacklers did. I think they were business decisions. And so I think, as Jews, you basically have to say, don't claim that what you did should be protected because of what your religion is. But I think if we're talking about it in Hebrew school or, to our kids, you have to make it clear that if you're going to act like you're in business and you're making business decisions, fine. But don't use religion or ethics or whatever, to hide what you're doing. You can't use that as a cloak. It would be like, I don't know, choose your evil businessman of the day. I mean, no one says, I don't think Rupert Murdoch walks around and says, well, because of what the Australians did in World War II, I shouldn't be criticized. I mean, it's, I worked for the Wall Street Journal. I mean, bad businessmen come in many flavors, and you just, you criticize them for what they do. The danger, of course, is it feeds, it does feed some of these right-wing Christian nationalist things. That's what's dangerous. I think that's why Jews get nervous, is because when Jews act badly, it becomes weaponized. And I think that's the part that makes Jews nervous, right? You don't get a narrative that says, oh, let's find some Presbyterian businessmen who are acting badly. There is a nervousness about that, especially these days. And the Sackler thing, you can be sure, you don't have to go very far on the internet to see the Sackler thing being used in that way. And I think that's scary.
Jonathan, it comes across very evidently your deep research and passion for your book. You make a reference that it possibly will be made a movie. But then you went on to highlight that it's probably a life of Victor Sassoon, where if I can offer a suggestion, and moving forward more than moving in the past, I think the real story is the Kaduri family. They are very different than the Sassoons. They're very prominent now in China and Hong Kong and the region. They're humanitarians. They have empathy for the Chinese. And they are one of the prominent families now in Hong Kong that I think could bridge the gap with the rhetoric and the dialogue between America and China. Do you have any influence on the movie?
Well, if you want to give me $15 million, I'll set you up with Netflix. I mean, you never know. I mean, what's interesting is the book. I think it's being translated into like 9 or 10 languages. And it was a bestseller in Hong Kong, which doesn't surprise me. It is interesting that the Chinese are publishing it on the mainland, which, given the tensions with the U.S., kind of surprised me. So, you never know. No, I think the Kaduris are a great story, and I think they're in a difficult position. I mean, I think it's very. I mean, I think any Western company right now is trying to figure out how do you deal with China in this very assertive phase, and can you sort of walk that tightrope? If anyone can, it's probably the Kaduris. They are relentlessly optimistic, and they, I think, believe that they can pull it off. And certainly every businessman in the world who's dealt with China has made a pilgrimage to Michael Kaduri's office to try to figure out how you do it. And they are enormously patient, which I think is part of it, for sure.
In your talk, you said 3 things that I just want to come back to. First was that opium was legal. Second was that the Japanese surrounded Shanghai, but they did not take Shanghai.
Until Pearl Harbor.
Until Pearl Harbor. Well, just to be accurate, they decimated the Chinese part of Shanghai. They did not take the international sectors of Shanghai. So that's one factor. The other factor is that while opium might have been legal in England, it was specifically illegal in China. And the Opium Wars started because a Chinese official tried to enforce Chinese law in China and burned opium, British-owned opium, which gave Britain the pretext to start the war. Then you said a third thing, which I think you refer to the fact that Chinese were perhaps not seen as totally human, which, and so my question is, perhaps the Jewish, having been persecuted for all these years through history, represents a group that can be empathetic to that point of view. That they, while we view them as Caucasians, they have a fraught position among Caucasians. And so perhaps the Jews are in a better position to bridge that gap between, and I wonder if you might
No, that's a
comment
good point. You know, it's interesting, when I've spoken to Chinese audiences, one of the things, and I think the Chinese government sees this too, a number of Chinese audiences pointed out that the Sassoons and the Kaduris went out to help Jewish refugees in Shanghai, but did not really help the Chinese who were suffering. And yet, after that, they were prepared to help Chinese refugees in Hong Kong. So that in Shanghai, they acted like the other British, imperialists acted, but that the war changed their position. And so I think the experience that the Kaduris went through in Shanghai clearly made them more aware of suffering. And so in that way, I think that suffering connected them more to Chinese suffering. And so I think that part is true. I also think that the Jews, including the Kaduris, especially the Kaduris, always felt like outsiders. And so one of the things that's interesting is that the Sassoons were able to become British citizens very quickly. Eli Kaduri tried to become a British citizen for decades and was always turned away. And in fact, I found a thing from a British consul general in Hong Kong when Eli Kaduri applies for British citizenship. And the consul general says, if we give it to Eli Kaduri, we'll have to give citizenship to a lot of them, meaning a lot of these Baghdad Jews. And he finally gets citizenship in like 1920. And so I think the Kaduris always felt like outsiders. And so I think there's a way in which the communist government understood that the Kaduris weren't really part of the British, establishment. And so when the negotiations over the handover were taking place, the communists opened like a third channel to the Kaduris and worked with them because they knew that they weren't really part of the British aristocracy. And so in that sense, I think the Kaduris were different and had more sympathy. And in fact, Lawrence Kaduri was made a member of the British House of Lords. And I admire him for this. He actually fought for citizenship for a whole group of the Hong Kong Chinese, felt that they should have citizenship. And he didn't have to do that. And they didn't get it, and he lost, but he really fought for them. And I think that's something, because I think he recognized that these outsiders had to stick together. And I admire him for that. But I think it was their experience, they were interned by the Japanese, they suffered, all their money couldn't protect them. And I think that was a way in which the war brought home that they were vulnerable. The Sassoons were never, they always felt more British than Jewish. Even though the British always saw them as more Jewish than British, the Sassoons always thought they were more British than Jewish. The Kaduris always knew they were more Jewish than British. Would you agree? Because you've worked with them. Do you think that's true? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. I was wondering, yes, I was wondering whether given the Chinese focus on the war of humiliation and the era of humiliation, and which continues today in terms of their psychology and their sort of hostile approach to the West, Britain, United States, all of us. I was wondering why they would then look at the Jewish people who had, the families who had basically bought and sold opium and their embarrassment about that, why they would then consult with them and be interested in them given their given that that's their history and the Chinese seem to have a long memory?
Yeah, I think the Chinese at this point, they use that kind of, what do you want to say, instrumentally. In other words, the Chinese are very good at using history when they want to, right? And so if they're in a negotiation and they can score a point off you by bringing something up, they'll do it. On the other hand, if they want to close the deal, they won't mention it. So, I mean, the Kaduris will talk about this. You know, they'll be negotiating a business deal, and suddenly the Chinese side will say, well, you know, your father in 1936, and they'll take out something and sort of bring it out. And so I think at this point, it's really, you know, what is true though, and look, the US is no different. Nationalism can be stirred up whenever you want. So for example now, Abe, the Japanese prime minister who was just assassinated, is very unpopular in China because he was very much a nationalist and took a very strong line against China. And so you have a lot of Chinese happy that he was assassinated. And Chinese social media, people are applauding and all that. The government could shut that down immediately if they wanted to. But they're letting it go because it serves their purposes. So I think that, you know, the government kind of uses that when they want to. And I think that the Kaduris are one of the biggest foreign investors in China right now. So, you know, they're the good guys, right? And the Sassoons haven't invested a great deal of money. So they're not that important. So I think they tend to sort of, you know, bring it out when it suits them.
There's a couple more hands up, but we're just about out of time. I want to ask the last question.
Sure.
We just have about a minute and a half, so I don't know if you can just maybe sum this up or give us just a few things to think about. But I mentioned early on that you're teaching and dealing with young people in education today. Can you give us just a little idea of what the tenor is? We've got cancel culture, we've got critical race theory, we've got all kinds of things going on. What do you think's going on?
I'm an optimist because I find when you actually deal with students, I'm much more optimistic than when I read stories about it or follow people on Twitter or things like that. You follow people on Twitter, you know, you read this stuff, you talk among yourselves. Even when I talk to people, the world's going to hell, it's going to be terrible, things are awful, BDS is in control. I mean, I know people worry about that. When you sit in a class with like 15 or 30 students and you see them trying to work this stuff out, they're really trying to work it out. And they're thoughtful, and they want to do the right thing, and they're trying to listen to each other. And, you know, I have the students over to our house for dinner, and they're working at it. And look, a lot of us were insufferable when we were in college, and, you know, we turned out okay. And so I think that I think things are better than we think they are. But I also think we need to engage students or our grandchildren or nieces or nephews or young people we talk to and kind of hear them out and meet them where they are and give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, yes, there are going to be unpleasant people out there, but in my experience, when people are backed into a corner, I mean, we just had a young friend of ours, you know, the son of really good friends of ours, who on Twitter, you know, you just want to punch him, like, just shut up. But then, you know, you're sitting with him and he's talking about stuff and, you know, I don't agree with a lot of his points, but they're thoughtful and he's trying to think about it. And then when you ask him stuff, he kind of, you know, he gets there. And so I think there's got to be more of that conversation going on because, you know, Twitter is like the worst bar in the world. And if you live in that world, it's pretty depressing. But I think if we approach people in a calmer way and, you know, try to look for the best in them, I find that lowers everybody's blood pressure.
Before we give you a thank you, I say this at the end of every program, and so I won't stop saying it. Thank you for coming. The best things that you can do, one, you're already doing it, which is you're here. The next best thing that you can do is tomorrow or tonight when you go home, tell somebody that you know that you think would have enjoyed this, that they should check out what the Vail Symposium's doing. We're doing 40+ programs a year. They're all terrific on a variety of topics. We just want more and more people to be aware of it, and you're the best person to spread that word. The other thing that you can do, and I'll say it shamelessly, is you can support us, and many of you do, but we're always open to that. So we hope to see you next week when Bill George will be talking about discovering your true north and how that leadership and inspiration can help you in your own life. Let's give Jonathan Kaufman a big round of applause.